Being deployed in Afghanistan wasn't easy, but I always told myself it was worth it. Protecting my country gave me a purpose, and knowing I had Laura and Emily waiting back home kept me going. Laura and I had been married for 16 years. She was my rock, or so I thought, and Emily, our 15-year-old daughter, was the light of my life. I missed them every day, but I believed we were solid, a family that could weather any storm. One evening, after a grueling day, I received a video call from Emily. The connection was choppy, but I could tell she'd been crying. My heart sank. She was a strong kid. Seeing her in tears wasn't something I was used to. "Dad," her voice cracked as she wiped her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. "I need to tell you something, and I don't know how." "What's wrong, sweetheart? Are you okay?" I tried to stay calm, though my pulse quickened. I immediately assumed the worst: an accident, trouble at school, or maybe bullying. She took a shaky breath. "It's about Mom. She's been seeing someone else." Her words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them in for too long. I froze. "What are you saying, Emily?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. She hesitated, then blurted it out. "She's having an affair. With Richard Bennett." Richard Bennett. The mayor. A man I'd seen at community events, shaking hands and smiling for cameras. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. "Emily, how do you know this?" I managed to ask. My voice was steady, but inside, I was unraveling. Her tears started again. "I've seen things, Dad." Texts on her phone. And she brought him over once when she thought I wasn't home. The image hit me like a punch to the gut. Laura, the woman I'd built my life with, laughing, smiling, and betraying me right in front of our daughter. I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the anger threatening to boil over. "Emily, I'm so sorry you had to deal with this alone. You did the right thing telling me." She nodded, sniffling. "I didn't know if I should. I didn't want to ruin things. But I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." My heart ached for her. She was just a kid, forced to carry the weight of her mother's betrayal. "I'll handle this," I promised her, though I had no idea how. "You just focus on school and being a teenager, okay?" "I just want us to be okay, Dad," she whispered. "We will be," I said firmly, though the words felt hollow. "I promise." After the call ended, I sat there, staring at the wall of my cramped quarters. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and memories. Had I missed the signs? Was it my fault for being away so much? No. I pushed that thought aside. This wasn't on me. I requested emergency leave the next morning, citing a family issue. My commanding officer didn't ask many questions. He could probably see the tension in my face. Within days, I was on a plane home, my heart pounding with dread and determination. I needed to know the truth, and I needed to protect my daughter. Coming home after months of deployment should have been a moment of joy and relief. Instead, the tension hit me like a wall the moment I walked through the door. Laura greeted me with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked startled, as if my sudden presence had thrown off her balance. She hugged me, but it felt forced, mechanical, like she was fulfilling an obligation. Emily's reaction was the complete opposite. She practically ran into my arms, holding on tight, her shoulders trembling. I could tell she had been holding everything inside for too long. That hug wasn't just about missing me, it was about needing someone who could make things right. Laura was acting as if nothing had happened, putting on her usual routine of casual small talk and questions about my flight, but I could see cracks in her performance. Her tone was overly sweet, her laugh just a little too high-pitched. I watched her carefully, every movement, every word. It was like looking at a stranger. I noticed small things I hadn't before. She avoided looking me in the eye for more than a few seconds. Her phone never left her side, and she glanced at it often, her fingers twitching like she was waiting for something, or someone. Even the way she moved through the house was different, rushed and distracted, like she was trying to stay one step ahead of me. Emily lingered near me as much as she could, and I was grateful for it. I could feel her anger toward Laura, though she never said a word in front of her. It was there in the way she stiffened when Laura entered the room, in the way her gaze turned cold when her mother tried to talk to her. I had never seen my daughter like this, so guarded and withdrawn. It broke my heart to see what this had done to her. That first evening back, I sat in the living room, trying to piece everything together. Laura had gone upstairs, claiming she was tired, but it felt like an excuse to escape. I heard the faint sound of her voice from the bedroom. She was on a phone call. The door was shut, but her tone was hushed and sharp, The kind of tone you use when you're saying things you don't want anyone else to hear. Emily hovered in the doorway, watching me. Her eyes were filled with a mix of guilt and relief. She had been the one to tell me, and I knew she was afraid I might regret coming home. I didn't. If anything, I regretted not being here sooner. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Memories of Laura before all of this swirled in my mind, memories of her laughing, holding Emily as a baby, planning our future together. I couldn't reconcile those memories with the woman I had seen today, the woman who was capable of doing something so cruel. I decided I needed proof. I couldn't confront her without it. As much as I wanted to barge into the bedroom and demand the truth, I knew that wouldn't work. She would deny it, twist the blame onto me, and I wasn't ready for that battle yet. I had to be smart, for Emily's sake as much as my own. The next few days were a painful exercise in restraint. I observed, noting every inconsistency, every moment that didn't add up. I checked the shared family calendar and found gaps in Laura's schedule that she hadn't mentioned. Receipts from restaurants I knew we hadn't visited together were tucked into her purse. Late-night phone calls, whispers from behind closed doors, and the distant hollow sound of her laughter when she thought no one was listening. It all pointed to the truth I already knew. The hardest part was pretending I didn't see it. I had to act normal, to keep the peace for Emily's sake while I gathered what I needed. It was a slow, suffocating process, but I knew it was the only way. Laura was careful, but not careful enough. I began to piece together the evidence bit by bit. She wasn't just having an affair, she was flaunting it, confident that I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. That realization stung more than anything else. It wasn't just betrayal, it was arrogance. She thought I was too blind, too trusting, too absent to catch on. But she was wrong. I wasn't absent anymore. I was here, and I wasn't going to let her destroy our family without a fight. The moment came sooner than I expected. I had gathered enough to confront her, receipts from fancy restaurants we'd never been to, text messages I'd managed to glimpse when she left her phone unattended, and even a photograph sent by a neighbor who'd seen her with Richard Bennett at a hotel on the outskirts of town. Everything I needed was in my hands, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical burden. Laura had no idea. She carried on as if nothing had changed, smiling at me during dinner, making small talk that felt emptier than ever. But her mask slipped when she thought no one was watching. There was a tightness around her eyes, a tension in her shoulders. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't know how much I knew. One evening, I decided it was time. Emily was staying over at a friend's house, and the silence in the house was deafening. Laura was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with that familiar, distracted look. I walked in, my heart pounding but my resolve steady. I laid everything out on the table, literally. The receipts, the printed messages, and the photograph. Her eyes widened, but then something changed. Her face hardened, her mouth setting into a thin line. She didn't deny it outright. She didn't even look at the evidence for more than a second before brushing it aside as if it were meaningless. She accused me of being paranoid, of twisting things to suit some narrative I'd conjured in my head. She even tried to make it about my deployment, saying that my absence had created a void she didn't know how to fill. The excuses poured out of her, one after the other, like she had rehearsed them. I stayed quiet, letting her talk, letting her dig herself deeper. Her words were like knives, cutting away at every memory I'd cherished of our life together. She blamed the distance, the stress, even Emily's teenage moods, anything but her own choices. When it became clear that I wasn't going to argue, she switched tactics. She turned the blame on me, accusing me of being too focused on my work, of being emotionally unavailable. It was like watching a stranger take over her body, someone I didn't recognize and couldn't believe I had once loved. But no matter how much she deflected or lied, the truth was laid bare between us. There was no going back from this, no repairing the damage she had done. I told her as much, though my voice was calm, almost detached. Her response was as cold as the betrayal itself. She said she didn't regret her choices, that she deserved to be happy, even if it came at the expense of our family. Her selfishness was staggering, her lack of remorse cutting deeper than any of her excuses. That night, I slept on the couch. The house felt suffocating, every corner of it a reminder of what we had built together and what she had destroyed. Upstairs, I could hear her moving around, but I didn't care. I didn't care what she was thinking or feeling anymore. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, raw and aching, but it was joined by a new resolve. I wasn't going to let her lies dictate my life any longer. If she thought she could break me, she was wrong. The days after the confrontation felt like walking through the wreckage of an explosion. Everything I had once relied on, Laura's trust, the stability of our family, was gone. The house felt heavy with tension. Laura avoided me as much as possible, but when we did cross paths, she carried herself with an air of defiance. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. Emily, on the other hand, was spiraling. She wasn't the type to lash out, but the anger and betrayal were eating away at her. She barely spoke to Laura. When she did, her words were clipped and cold, filled with the kind of resentment I never thought I'd hear from my sweet, gentle daughter. It was as if her relationship with her mother had been shattered beyond repair, and I couldn't blame her. One afternoon, I found Emily sitting in her room, headphones on, staring blankly at her homework. I knew she was struggling to process everything, but I didn't want to push her. I sat down next to her and placed a hand on her shoulder, letting her know I was there. She leaned into me, and I could feel the weight she was carrying, the unspoken pain we both shared. Laura's attempts to salvage the situation were half-hearted at best. She would try to engage Emily in conversation, but her efforts always came off as insincere. Emily would either ignore her completely or give her short, biting responses that made it clear she wanted nothing to do with her. One evening, Laura tried to sit us both down at the dinner table as if nothing had changed. She cooked Emily's favorite meal, set the table with the good dishes, and acted like the perfect homemaker. But Emily didn't touch her plate. She sat there, staring at Laura with a look of quiet fury before excusing herself and retreating to her room. Laura turned to me, her face a mix of frustration and desperation. She started to say something, but I didn't respond. I just cleared the table and walked away, leaving her sitting there in silence. The fallout wasn't limited to our home. Word of Laura's affair had started to spread around town. I don't know how it got out. Maybe one of our neighbors had seen something, or maybe Richard Bennett wasn't as discreet as he thought. Whatever the case, the whispers were everywhere. Emily bore the brunt of it. Kids at school could be cruel, and the scandal gave them fresh ammunition. She came home one day with her shoulders slumped, her eyes red from crying. She told me she didn't want to go back, that she couldn't face the stares and the whispers. My heart broke for her. I reached out to her teachers, trying to make sure she had some kind of support at school. I even considered transferring her, but she begged me not to uproot her life any further. So, I did my best to be there for her, to remind her that we were a team, that we'd get through this together. Laura, meanwhile, seemed more concerned about her reputation than the damage she'd done to our family. She tried to spin the story in her favor, telling anyone who would listen that the rumors were exaggerated, that she and Richard had a professional relationship. But no one bought it, not even her closest friends. I could see the cracks forming in her carefully constructed facade. Her confidence wavered when she realized that the town wasn't on her side, that people were looking at her differently now. It was almost satisfying to watch, but the satisfaction was short-lived. The damage she had done to Emily and me outweighed any sense of vindication. At night, I lay awake, wondering how things had come to this. I replayed every moment of our marriage in my head, searching for signs I might have missed. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find an answer that justified her betrayal. What hurt the most wasn't the affair itself. It was the way she had destroyed the trust and love that had held our family together. And as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't let her actions define the rest of my life. My focus had to be on Emily and on rebuilding what little we had left. Making the decision to end a marriage isn't something you can prepare for, no matter how much pain you've endured. In those quiet hours after the confrontation, when the house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was any way to salvage what we had. But deep down, I already knew the answer. Laura's betrayal wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice she made over and over again, to prioritize herself above our family. She had lied, manipulated, and tried to paint herself as the victim, all while Emily and I were left to deal with the fallout. I couldn't forgive that, not for my sake, and not for Emily's. The next morning, I called a lawyer. It was a quiet, calculated decision, like flipping a switch. I gave him a brief overview of the situation and set up a meeting for the following week. The conversation felt surreal, like I was discussing someone else's life. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This was the first step toward reclaiming control, toward protecting what mattered most. Laura, of course, sensed something was happening. She wasn't oblivious, despite how much she pretended to be. She started hovering around me more, trying to initiate conversations that felt forced and shallow. She even attempted to act as if things were normal, like she could erase everything with a smile or a casual comment about dinner plans. One evening, as Emily was upstairs finishing her homework, Laura cornered me in the living room. She started talking about how she wanted to fix things, how we could go to counseling, start fresh, and find our way back to each other. Her words were carefully chosen, like she'd practiced them in the mirror. I stood there, watching her, trying to feel something. Anger, sadness, even pity, but I felt nothing. Her words didn't ring true. They were hollow, devoid of genuine remorse or understanding of the pain she'd caused. When I told her I had contacted a lawyer, her face crumpled for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered. She launched into a flurry of arguments, blaming everything from my deployment to my emotional unavailability. She said I was giving up on us too easily, that I owed it to her and to Emily to try harder. I stayed calm, explaining that this wasn't a decision I'd made lightly. I told her that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild, and that Emily and I deserved better than living in the shadow of her lies. Laura's response was a mix of anger and desperation. She accused me of being selfish, of putting my pride above our family. But her words had no power over me anymore. I'd spent weeks piecing together the truth, reliving every moment of betrayal, and feeling the weight of her actions on Emily's shoulders. I was done carrying that weight. The days that followed were a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Telling Emily was the hardest part. She had already been through so much, and I hated the thought of adding to her burden. But when I sat her down and explained that I was filing for divorce, she surprised me. She didn't cry or get angry. Instead, she nodded, her expression calm but resolute. It was as if she had been expecting this all along. She told me she just wanted us to be okay, that she didn't want to live in a house filled with tension and lies. Her maturity humbled me, but it also broke my heart. No child should have to grow up so fast. Laura, on the other hand, oscillated between denial and hostility. She made it clear she wasn't going to make this easy. She accused me of turning Emily against her, of exaggerating the affair to make her look like the villain. Her defensiveness only reinforced my decision. One evening, I overheard Laura and Emily arguing. Emily had finally reached her breaking point. She told her mother exactly how she felt, how betrayed, hurt, and disgusted she was by what she'd done. Laura tried to defend herself, but Emily wasn't having it. She stormed out of the room and came straight to me, her eyes filled with tears but her voice steady. She told me she wanted to stay with me, that she couldn't trust her mother anymore. Hearing those words hurt more than I expected. As much as I resented Laura for what she'd done, I had never wanted to see Emily lose her relationship with her. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I thought about the life I had envisioned for us when we first got married. I had pictured family dinners, vacations, and watching Emily grow up in a home filled with love and stability. Instead, I was here, picking up the pieces of a broken marriage and trying to shield my daughter from the fallout. But I knew this was the right path. The divorce wasn't just about ending my relationship with Laura, it was about protecting Emily, about giving her a chance to grow up in an environment where trust and respect weren't just empty words. The paperwork was filed within weeks. Laura's reaction was predictable: anger, tears, and more attempts to shift the blame. But it didn't matter anymore. I had made my choice, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control of my life. There was still a long road ahead, filled with challenges and uncertainty. But as I looked at Emily, I knew one thing for sure: we would face it together. And no matter how hard it got, we would come out stronger on the other side. As the divorce proceedings began, the ripple effects of Laura's actions spread further than I could have imagined. In our small town, secrets had a way of slipping out, and the news of her affair with Richard Bennett became the scandal everyone was talking about. I could feel it every time I stepped outside. Neighbors who had once waved warmly now avoided eye contact or watched me with quiet pity. At the grocery store, conversations would abruptly stop when I walked past. I wasn't looking for sympathy, but the whispers and stares made it impossible to escape the weight of what had happened. Emily bore the brunt of it. High school is brutal on a good day, but being the daughter of the town's newest scandal made her a target. The rumors followed her through the hallways, whispered behind her back and sometimes thrown directly in her face. Kids would mock her, saying things like, "Is your mom dating the mayor now?" Or, "What's it like having your family in the tabloids?" She came home one day, slammed her backpack down, and locked herself in her room. I let her have some time alone before knocking softly on her door. When I went in, she was sitting on the floor, staring at her phone with tears streaming down her face. She showed me a group chat where some kids had been making jokes about our family. It took everything in me not to march down to that school and confront those kids myself, but I knew that wouldn't help. Instead, I assured her that none of this was her fault and promised her we would get through it together. I emailed her school counselor, explaining the situation and asking for support, but I could see the damage was already done. Emily started withdrawing from her friends, spending more time in her room, headphones on to block out the world. Meanwhile, Laura seemed to be unraveling. The confidence she had once worn like armor was cracking under the weight of the judgment around her. Her so-called friends in town, women she had spent countless afternoons with at book clubs and fundraisers, were now keeping their distance. Some of them even reached out to me, offering their condolences or making thinly veiled digs about Laura's poor choices. But Laura wasn't one to admit defeat easily. She tried to spin the narrative in her favor, telling anyone who would listen that I was controlling, that the marriage had been falling apart long before Richard came into the picture. She painted herself as the victim, the misunderstood wife who had been driven to seek happiness elsewhere. Her attempts at damage control only made things worse. People saw through her excuses, and the more she tried to defend herself, the more isolated she became. I should have felt some satisfaction in watching her face the consequences of her actions, but all I could feel was exhaustion. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted peace. Richard Bennett, for his part, seemed to escape most of the fallout. As the mayor, he was skilled at dodging accountability, brushing off the rumors as malicious gossip and shifting attention back to his political agenda. He avoided me entirely, which was probably for the best. I wasn't sure what I'd do if I ever came face to face with him. The nights were the hardest. After Emily went to bed, I'd sit alone in the living room, the silence of the house pressing down on me. I'd think about how quickly everything had fallen apart, how the life I had built with Laura had turned into something I didn't even recognize. I'd think about Emily, about how unfair it was that she had to bear the weight of something she didn't cause. The only thing that kept me going was the promise I had made to her, to protect her, to make sure she knew she wasn't alone. I started spending more time with her, taking her out for ice cream, watching her favorite movies, and encouraging her to talk to me about anything she was feeling. It wasn't much, but it was something. The community's judgment didn't stop at whispers and gossip. There were tangible consequences, too. Emily's invitations to parties and hangouts dwindled. Parents who had once encouraged their kids to spend time with her now seemed wary, as if our family's troubles were contagious. I hated seeing her go through that, but I reminded her that the people who truly cared about her would stick around. For me, the isolation was less painful. I had always been more introverted, content to keep a small circle of close friends. But even those friends struggled with how to handle the situation. Some offered their support, while others kept their distance, unsure of what to say. One day, an old friend from my National Guard unit called to check in. He had heard about the divorce through the grapevine and wanted to let me know he was there if I needed anything. That call reminded me that I wasn't completely alone, and it gave me a small sense of hope. Through it all, I kept my focus on Emily. Every decision I made was for her, to give her some sense of stability, to remind her that she was loved. I knew I couldn't shield her from everything, but I could stand beside her and face it together. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new, something that would test us but also make us stronger. And no matter how hard it got, we would keep moving forward, one step at a time. I thought I'd reached the limit of what Laura could take from me, but I was wrong. Just when I'd begun to think things couldn't get any worse, she proved me wrong in the most gut-wrenching way. The tension in the house had reached its breaking point. Laura spent most of her time out, coming home late with flimsy excuses about errands or catching up with old friends. Her behavior wasn't just suspicious, it was insulting. She made no effort to hide the fact that she didn't care how her actions affected Emily or me. I tried to keep things civil for Emily's sake. She had enough on her plate without seeing her parents fighting every time they were in the same room. But Laura seemed determined to push every boundary. She spoke to me with contempt, her words dripping with venom whenever we had to discuss something practical, like bills or parenting arrangements. And then it happened. One evening, after putting Emily to bed, I heard Laura on the phone in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but her voice carried down the hall. She was speaking in hushed tones, but the anger in her voice was unmistakable. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough to realize she was talking to Richard Bennett. It wasn't over. After everything, the lies, the humiliation, the pain she had caused Emily and me, she was still in contact with him. I stood frozen in the hallway, a mix of fury and disbelief washing over me. How could she be so brazen? So careless? The audacity of it all made my blood boil. I confronted her the next morning. I didn't want to make a scene with Emily in the house, so I waited until she left for school. When I asked her about the phone call, she didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she rolled her eyes and accused me of spying on her, as if I were the one in the wrong. Her arrogance was infuriating. She told me she and Richard were just friends, and that I needed to let go of my paranoia. But I wasn't buying it. Her excuses had run dry, and her dismissive attitude only confirmed what I already knew. That evening, Emily overheard part of our argument. She stormed into the room, her face red with anger, and demanded to know if her mother was still seeing Richard. Laura hesitated, which was all the answer Emily needed. The look on Emily's face was something I'll never forget. It was a mix of heartbreak and fury, the kind of pain that no child should ever have to feel. She turned to me and said, "She doesn't care about us, Dad. She only cares about herself." Laura tried to defend herself, but Emily wasn't having it. She told her mother exactly how much she had hurt her, how humiliating it was to face the rumors at school, and how she couldn't believe Laura could continue to betray us after everything. Laura stood there, stunned into silence. For the first time, I saw a crack in her facade. But it was too little, too late. Emily ran to her room, slamming the door behind her. I wanted to go after her, to comfort her, but I knew she needed space. Instead, I turned to Laura, who was now looking at me with a mixture of anger and shame. I told her, calmly but firmly, that this was the last straw. There was no fixing what she had done. I didn't raise my voice, didn't lash out. I just stated the truth. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. That night, I packed up the last of her things. She had already been staying in the guest room, but now it was time for her to leave the house completely. She tried to argue, saying she needed more time, but I didn't budge. I wasn't going to let her selfishness poison Emily's life any further. The next morning, Laura collected her belongings. Emily stayed in her room, refusing to come out. As Laura loaded the last box into her car, she turned to me and said, "You'll regret this someday." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. After she drove away, I knocked on Emily's door and told her it was over, that her mother was gone, and we didn't have to deal with her lies anymore. She didn't say anything, but later that evening, she sat next to me on the couch, leaning her head against my shoulder. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I knew we were on the path to healing, even if it was a long road ahead. Laura's betrayal had left scars, but it had also strengthened the bond between Emily and me. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a small glimmer of hope. When Laura drove away, it felt like a storm had finally passed, leaving behind a quiet stillness. The house wasn't the same, it would never be the same, but there was something freeing about knowing we didn't have to walk on eggshells anymore. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter. Emily and I began to rebuild in small ways. At first, it was just little things. Having breakfast together without the tension hanging over us, laughing at a silly movie, or spending an afternoon cleaning out the house. We went through the rooms, boxing up the remnants of Laura's presence. It was painful in some ways, but it also felt like we were reclaiming our space, making it ours again. Emily's anger toward her mother didn't fade overnight. There were moments when she'd mutter something sharp under her breath or slam her door after a difficult day at school. But I could see she was starting to heal, little by little. She began opening up more, talking to me about her feelings, about how hard it was to face the whispers and stares at school. I did my best to listen without judgment, to be the steady presence she needed. I reminded her again and again that none of this was her fault, that we would get through it together. One afternoon, Laura came back to pick up some things she had left behind. She had emailed me a list, some clothes, photo albums, and other personal items. I told her she could come while Emily was out, but when she arrived, Emily came home earlier than expected. I'll never forget the look on Emily's face when she saw her mother standing there, sorting through boxes. Laura tried to greet her, but Emily ignored her completely. As she walked past, she noticed Laura had packed a box with some of her personal items, including a bottle of birth control pills that had been left in the bathroom cabinet. Emily picked it up, stared at it for a moment, and then turned to Laura with a cold, almost mocking expression. "Don't forget these," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, before placing the box on the floor and walking away. Laura looked at me as if she expected me to say something, but I didn't. I just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for her to finish and leave. She packed the rest of her things in silence and left without another word. After she was gone, Emily sat down next to me on the couch, and we just sat there, not saying anything. It was one of those quiet moments where words weren't needed. We were both exhausted but relieved. The weeks that followed were filled with adjustments. I took on more at home, cooking, cleaning, making sure Emily had everything she needed. It wasn't easy, but it felt good to focus on something productive, something that mattered. Emily slowly began to find her footing again. She reconnected with a few close friends who stood by her during the chaos, and I noticed her laughter coming back, hesitant at first but growing stronger. She even started asking about extracurricular activities she might want to try, things to take her mind off the past. For me, moving forward meant redefining what life looked like without Laura. I spent more time at the gym, reconnecting with old friends, and even picking up hobbies I'd set aside years ago. It wasn't about distracting myself, it was about finding myself again, remembering who I was before everything fell apart. One evening, as Emily and I were eating dinner, she looked up at me and said, "I think we're going to be okay, Dad." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and I had to take a moment to compose myself before responding. I told her I thought so too. The divorce was finalized a few months later. Laura tried to push for more than her fair share, claiming she needed stability for herself, but the evidence I'd gathered about the affair made her arguments fall flat in court. In the end, I kept the house, and Emily stayed with me full-time. Laura moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, and though she tried to reach out to Emily, the relationship was strained at best. Richard Bennett quietly resigned from his position a few months after the affair became public knowledge. I didn't feel much satisfaction in that. The damage had already been done, and his fall from grace didn't undo what he and Laura had put us through. But life went on. Slowly, the whispers faded, the stares lessened, and the weight of the scandal began to lift. Emily and I found a new rhythm, one built on honesty, trust, and a shared determination to move forward. There were still tough days, of course. Some nights, the loneliness would creep in, and I'd find myself thinking about everything that had happened, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. But those moments didn't last long. I'd remind myself of the progress we'd made, of the bond Emily and I had strengthened through all of this. The scars from Laura's betrayal would never fully heal, but they didn't define us. We were more than the pain she had caused, more than the mistakes she had made. One day, as we were walking home from the park, Emily slipped her hand into mine and said, "I'm glad it's just us now." I squeezed her hand and nodded, a lump forming in my throat. In that moment, I realized that while we had lost so much, we had also gained something precious. A deeper understanding of what it meant to be a family, of what it meant to truly stand by each other. We weren't just moving forward. We were rebuilding, together. And that was enough.